Ladies and gentlemen, my Vice Chancellor, Professor Hilary Beckles.
"500 years ago, something totally unknown to humanity, never seen on planet Earth, erupted from the depth of hell and was brought to the Caribbean. That thing was called chattel slavery. Never before in the history of humanity had such an institution found expression on planet Earth. It was brought to the Caribbean in the first instance as a strategy to exploit enchained African people for the wealth creation of those who possessed a military advantage. Chattel slavery was that institution that defined human beings as non-human property, chattel, and real estate. It was the first time in human history that a people had been so defined and used for such purposes. We know the value and the meaning of property. Property is that thing which you could buy, you could sell, you could mortgage, you could lease, you could rent, you can use as currency. All of those characteristics that we know about property, you can pass it on to your children, you can use it in a transaction. All of those characteristics of property were applied to African people. The British were the first to commit this system to legislation, and as early as 1636, and then later in the slave code, the British Slave Code 1661, Africans were deemed to be non-human. It was a system that was built by the entire British and European communities. The royal families endorsed it, invested in it, owned it, legitimized it through their parliaments and royal prerogatives, and it became common culture. It became the common culture, the norm of the British and the Europeans in their empires. It was not only a system of chattel enslavement, it was also a system of genocide. And it was the second Caribbean genocide. We heard of the genocide of the indigenous people of Kalinago, who fought heroically against the invasion of their civilization. But when the Africans were brought in, the genocide continued. You only have to look at the numbers. The British brought 3.5 million Africans into the Caribbean. 3.5 million. At emancipation, there were 600,000 remaining. How do you reduce 3.5 million people down to 600,000? It was the economics of the system. The economics of the system dictated that it was more profitable to buy an African on the auction block, use that African intensively for 7 to 10 years, work that African to death, and replace that African. The expectation, therefore, was the investment, 7 years of wealth extraction, and the replacement of that person. In other words, the economics of the system did not support the concept of an old African. Old age, aging. The system saw that as a cost. It was efficient to buy that youth, 7 to 10 years, replace that person, and so on and so forth. And that is why 3 million people were reduced to 600,000. The Caribbean system was the most brutal social organization known to man. There was nowhere in the world were any people exposed to such a structure. It was indeed unique and historic. We are honored here to be hosting the Trevelyan family in the Spice Isle. The Trevelyan family were leading architects in this system. They were among the greatest beneficiaries of this system. They were among the leading advocates of this system, and Grenada was the place from which their enrichment took place. It's an enrichment that enabled a family to diversify in its professional elitism and to become one of the most sustainable families in Britain. It's a family that at emancipation was in the ownership of just over 1,000 Grenadians, slaves, for which they were compensated at full market value. That wealth from the compensation enabled the family to consolidate and launch its future into today. When I was a history student in Britain, one of the leading and most distinguished historians that dominated the writing and teaching of history was Sir G. Trevelyan, distinguished member of this family that spread its professional competence across multiple areas of British life. This family was a central part of the slavocracy of the world. It's a family that used its formidable intellectual and professional achievements to generate enormous wealth from slavery, and to use that wealth for its own enrichment as well as the promotion of the British economy. The resistance to the slavery and the genocide was everywhere. The African people across the Caribbean fought, ran away, resisted the best they could against this evil. This resistance was also a critical part of their mortality. The British were among the most creative of the Europeans in finding strategies to punish Africans in resistance. I am currently preparing a manuscript for publication entitled 1,000 Ways to Punish Rebellious Africans in the Caribbean. The ones you know are the common ones. You cut off their hands, you cut off their feet, you burn them in oil, you rape the women, you sell the children, you put them in cages. These are the ones you know. These are the ones you probably have seen in movies. But behind that, there were hundreds of methods that were used. Those methods have been so well documented, it is not difficult for us to research them. And it would be remiss of me not to speak of this matter from the perspective of gender. You cannot speak about slavery without speaking specifically about women, the women who were enslaved. Because the experience in slavery of men, black men, was fundamentally different from the experiences of women. And we cannot gloss it over by speaking about slavery. There were two slaveries. Let us look at the women so we understand where we are with this system. The system of chattel slavery was built upon the identity of the woman. The woman was the carrier of the status. The black woman was the carrier of the status of slavery. A child, a black child at birth, took its status from the mother. That was the law. If the mother was white, and if the father was a slave man, that child was born free, because a white woman could not give birth to a slave child. And in our archives, there are dozens and dozens of mixed race babies whose fathers were slave men and their mothers were white. Those babies were born free. The system was designed this way to enable white men to have access to all of the black women they owned, and by raping and impregnating black women, those babies were born slaves, so they could not have a claim on their father's property. You understand the law of this? So the white man protected himself from the claims of his mixed race children by legalizing that those children were born slaves and therefore could not litigate against their father's property. This system was carefully designed and structured. So a black woman, therefore, could not be raped because you cannot rape property. You cannot rape property. And the black woman was what was called perfect property. Now, what is perfect property? You buy it, you could rent it, lease it, mortgage it, sell it, and you could rape it. All of the characteristics. And importantly, when a black enslaved woman gave birth to a child that was also a slave, when that child reaches the age of 14, 15, that child had replaced the investment cost of the mother. So you go to the harbor, you buy a black woman off the auction block, bring her back to the plantation, you pay 30 pounds for her. Her child reaches 12, 13, the child is now worth 30 pounds. So the mother has replaced her costs. All other children are now what you call perfect investments. All the subsequent babies are revenue streams. It's a revenue stream. You have already got your cost back from the first child. All the other children is now what we call in economics pure profit. Pure profit. So each child was capitalizing the estate. Each child, each year, was adding to the capitalization value of the estate. And this is how the system was designed. The Trevelyan family has risen up 1,000,000 miles to be here with us today. While the Trevelyan families is meeting with us today to speak about this history, to reflect upon this history, next week arriving in Jamaica to continue this conversation, we have invited at the university next week a cohort of 15 African kings and queens, 7 kings and 8 queens, to come to the Caribbean to talk to us about what slavery did to their royal families, how they survived slavery, how they were implicated in some of the legacies of slavery. So today, we are having this conversation with British descendants of enslavers. And next week in Jamaica, this week in Jamaica, we are having that conversation with the other side of the equation. The Africans are coming to the Caribbean. The kings and queens whose societies were ravished by slavery, they're coming here to talk about what slavery meant to their African world. We are in the 7th phase of the reparations movement. From the moment chattel slavery was built in the Caribbean, the resistance started and the reparations movement began. We have looked at the various phases of the reparations movement. In the 1830s, when the Trevelyan family and other families were receiving their reparations, the enslaved people also called upon the British government for their reparations. The 1830s was the beginning of this movement where the emancipated people said, how about us? Is our labor, is our dignity, our humanity that was stripped from us, we are the ones to receive reparations, not the enslavers. But the enslavers dominated the British Parliament. They were the legislators. So the enslavers raided the British treasury of £20 million to pay themselves. It was the largest single expenditure ever undertaken by the British Parliament to compensate the slave owners for their lost property. It was 40% of the national expenditure for that year. One act, 40% of the expenditure of a nation paid over to the enslavers. The enslaved received nothing. In fact, when the enslavers asked for their reparations, the British Parliament told them, you should be grateful that we are giving you freedom. Take your freedom and be quiet. That was the posture. And there were many people in the British Parliament, people like Buxton. There were many people in civil society, people like Clarkson, who were saying, to compensate the slave owners is a crime greater than the crime they had already committed. It's a crime to compensate them after they had committed a crime. You do not give a bank robber a reward for his robbery. Why are we compensating the slave owners? It's the enslaved who should be compensated. And that was debated in the British Parliament, and the British Parliament rejected that perspective and compensated the slave owners. So here we are now in another phase of this movement, because we never gave up as a people. We heard reference to the role of the Rastafari. From the moment those Africans returned from Ethiopia, having gone to fought against the fascism of the Italians, and they returned to the Caribbean and began the Rastafari movement, they began to speak about African history, African culture, African dignity, and reparations. So it's been 100 years, 100 years of Rastafari pushing this movement. Yeah. And we know this to be true because we know our history. The slavery had left behind, the scars, the reduction in the love of blackness, the diminished respect for Africanness. All of these things were part of that white supremacy system that left many black people ashamed of their Africanness. It was the Rastafari who demanded the restoration of those identities, and quite frankly began to teach us all how to respect who we are and how to fight this legacy. It was an honor for me to meet Laura Trevelyan and to begin a conversation with her about this history. A critical moment was when Laura organized a town hall meeting with her entire family. I think there were over 50 or 60 of them in a Zoom town hall. And I was able to speak with them about the importance of having a family that not only became enriched out of slavery, but within it now has an intellectual class of people. Laura herself is a distinguished communicator. There was Professor Trevelyan. There were all of these people who are now in the intellectual class of Britain. Not just bankers and lawyers, but people who can now speak about this legacy through different eyes. And it was a remarkable discovery to find how Laura herself was prepared to lead her family, hold them by the hand, and lead them to Grenada today. These are developments that are transforming of the world. These are developments that require courage and commitment. To look into your history, your past, and to recognize that a crime has been committed, a crime that has led to your own enrichment and privilege, and to be able to say, this was wrong. It was inhumane. In the emancipation debate in the British Parliament, those who were trying to end slavery argued in the Parliament that slavery was not just a sin within the Christian theology. It was not just immoral in normal social culture, but that it was criminal. It was a criminal system to take a human being, possess their labor as your labor, have that labor without the support of that person, and use that person's labor, which you are stealing from that person, their labor, and taking that labor you have stolen for yourselves and deprive that person of the fruit of their labor. Every human is entitled to the fruit of their labor. That was the argument which was used to say that slavery was a criminal system, and all of those who administer it were involved in criminal activity. But for a family to say, we wish to confront this past, and we wish to use the CARICOM Reparations Commission's framework to guide the conversation, where there is an apology, where there is an acknowledgement of a crime, and where there is a genuine and sincere desire to participate in an act of repair. Acts of repair will always be diversified and controversial, always will be, because there are many who will say, how do you compensate 20 million people for 200 years of unpaid labor? And this is what Sir Arthur Lewis said in his famous book, 1939, Sir Arthur Lewis. And I want to say, Sir Arthur Lewis wrote that book, Labor in the West Indies, when he was 24 years old, in which he argued that Britain had 200 years of free labor from 20 million people in the Caribbean. How do you put a value on that? The value of that is seen in the industrialization of Britain. That's where you see it. When you drive through Birmingham City, Manchester, Liverpool, you drive through the industrial complex of Britain, that is where you see the input of 200 years of free labor from 20 million people. Trillions of pounds of value. But the reparations movement have said that Britain owed the black people of the Caribbean this debt. And we are saying that the only way this Caribbean is going to rise up and find that level of competitiveness in economic reform, economic restructuring, is when Britain acknowledges that it has a debt to the Caribbean and it must work with the governments and the private sector. This is why some of us have committed our lives to this movement. Because we know that the Caribbean is going to flounder in the decades ahead, despite our best efforts. And don't think that we have been sitting around on our laurels waiting for handouts. We're not talking about that. We are saying that when Britain gave these countries their independence, Britain left these countries in a total and complete mess, having extracted the wealth, sucked them dry, and leave them like that. Right. And we are expected to clean up their mess and begin the process of nation building, begin the process of developing our economies, building institutions, health, education, infrastructure. We were told you are on your own. And that is what nation building has meant to us in the Caribbean, that we are on our own, having been the site of wealth extraction. Some of the statistics are terrible. I have looked at Jamaica because it's the largest of our societies. In 1962, they signed off, told Jamaica you can have your independence and go. And 80% of the black people could not read or write. How do you begin to build a nation if 3/4 of your people cannot read or write after you have dominated them for 300 years? And Britain took Jamaica in 1655. And between 1655 and 1962, 3/4 of the black people cannot read or write. And then you give them independence and say, go and develop. Now, I believe that we in the Caribbean have done magnificently to take that mess we inherited and build out stable democracies. We have helped ourselves. We have helped ourselves to achieve what we want to achieve. And I can speak of that from the point of view of the University of the West Indies. The British, we were very grateful, gave us a small grant in 1948 to set up the University of the West Indies. Fine. They gave us a grant to set up a small medical school with 33 students. Small grant, University of the West Indies, 33 medical students. And that's how we started. We were appreciative of that grant. We were appreciative of that start. But look at it now. 55,000 students scattered across the entire Caribbean. 5 campuses ranked in the top 1.5% of the best universities in the world. Now, that is our achievement. The question is, when Britain returns to this region to help to clean up the mess that we are dealing with, how much further this region would advance and how much more quickly it will advance. The reparations movement is a call for partnership. It's a call for partnership. It's a call for diminishing the debt owed to the people of this region. And it's a call to have a shared vision for the future. That is what we are calling for. We're not calling for racial strife. We're not calling for international conflict. We believe reparations is the key for a win-win strategy for both sides of this conversation. And this is why I feel honored to be a part of the welcoming of the Trevelyan's here today. To begin, in a small but powerful way, this journey of conciliation, this journey of partnering, and this journey of having a shared future for everyone. We know the legacy of slavery here in Grenada. We know the legacy. All of us can see it. The poverty, the lack of competitive industries that require technology and science to bring them to a higher level. We know all of those issues. The legacy of colonization, we know that. And this is why we have said whatever resources are made available should go to the children of Grenada who would wish to explore their creative imaginations and be whatever they want to be. I hope that one of them will want to be an historian. But whatever they want to be, to have some resources available to them, to allow them to be who their ancestors would wish them to be, which is to be upright, dignified, strong black people for the future. That's what we want. Now, I was at a conference in Paris in November, and the French government had said there's a national fuel shortage, so no public building should be heated above 19 degrees. And I'm in this boardroom, and I'm wearing my scarf, my tam, my gloves, my winter jacket, and I'm wrapped up from top to bottom, sitting there freezing to death, discussing UNESCO's business. The chairman of the committee apologized to me for the fact that as a black man I cannot handle the space. And I said to him, Mr. Chairman, we, the black people of this planet, we are the first humans on this planet. And we chose Africa for a reason. We could have chosen to live anywhere on this planet, but we chose Africa for a reason. And this is not it. So we are looking at this matter from the depth of history as a black people who have spread their DNA all over the world. And we want justice, we want equality, and we want respect for the dignity of all peoples. We do not believe in a hierarchical world of white people, brown people, black people. No, no, we believe in a horizontal world. All people, horizontally structured in terms of their living capacity. Reparations is about that horizontal world for all of humanity. I thank you.